Wisconsin can be so cold. The scales of justice can erode. If we accept lies big and bold, we forget we live on Avery Road.
Hello everybody, this is Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases, but also as time passes I've been covering other cases such as the Staircase or OJ and many wrongful convictions of youth. I go over the documents, the photos, the videos, anything case related. So stay tuned, because I have many more videos, just like the one you're about to see. Alright, so how you doing everybody? Today we're here with part 5 of the Texas Tech Law Panel discussion. This is basically the Q&A session. So this is where we get to see the students and other faculty out in the audience that have questions for the 4 panelists. The further questions and stuff that they might have, so they get to ask more questions and we get a little bit more out of the panelists and stuff here. All really interesting stuff, really good panelists in my opinion. I mean, and I think a lot of people agree because everybody's been just over the moon about these videos, so that's been pretty cool. So yeah, so we're looking at all 4 of these panelists up there now talking, and I tell you what, the second speaker, he was the one that was basically ripping apart Ken Kratz and his like, the evidence MAM left out. That guy's brilliant, man. He's just absolutely brilliant. So we're gonna go ahead and see now the question and answer session there at Texas Tech Law Panel discussion, and we'll come on back at the end one more time. We'll see you then.
It is about 3:35 now, and because I'm anticipating that we're going to have a lot of questions, why don't I go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Both Shelby and Sarah will be going around with microphones, and they'll catch you when your hand's up. And let's have the panel take some questions. Thank you very much to the panelists. It was wonderful.
Hi, thank you for coming. This question's probably more centered towards Professor Beck as a public defender, but one of the scenes that stuck out to me most was in the Brendan Dassey when the investigator for his defense attorney was questioning him, and he was like, I didn't do it, and he wrote it down, and then he was like, no, draw the picture, you put the chains here and that. And I guess as a public defender, how's, I guess, the ethical side of that, and then as a prosecutor, how do you deal with seeing that confession and being like, hey, that wasn't really good. Of course. Yeah, just how do you deal with that?
Well, I'll give you my interpretation of what I think is going on there, okay? I think that, first of all, in order to suppress a confession as coerced, what has to be proven is that someone in authority coerced the confession, and then secondarily you have to show that the confession was involuntary. That's from a case before the United States Supreme Court called Colorado versus Conley. That's the standard. So the investigator for the pretrial defense attorney of Dassey, in doing so, that would not be subject to suppression under the standard analysis. So what I think is happening is the pretrial defense attorney, in good motives, possibly, made a deal with the prosecutor behind the scenes, wherein the prosecutor said, look, I'm going to let this guy off light. He's got to confess, and he's got to testify against Avery, and if he doesn't do that, we're going to throw away the key. We're going to put him in jail, throw away the key. That's what ended up happening. So I think what the defense attorney did is he got his investigator to go in there, put the screws to his client in the hopes that his client would only serve a portion of his life in jail rather than all of it. His attorney likely knew that his client was in big trouble in that jurisdiction. So, I think there's so many ethical problems with that. I've never seen You know, as criminal defense attorneys, we do have to, quote unquote, lean on clients sometime to make decisions in their own best interest. But there is an ethical boundary there, and this far exceeded the ethical boundary. Although I do suspect that his defense attorney had good motives in doing so. He wanted his client to not spend the rest of his life in jail. But you can never cross a line like that. So that's kind of my interpretation of it.
And my issue, honestly, I can tell you when I was watching that portion of that episode, truly, I completely expected that investigator to go in there. And as soon as I saw him using those techniques, I thought, oh, this is brilliant. Because I thought that defense attorney was going to have the investigator have Brendan give like a completely, like basically coerce him, use the same strategy that the police had done, but get him to confess to something, to totally different facts, right? Because then I thought, well, that's brilliant. Take it to the DA and show him. Look, this kid is highly impressionable. But then I watched what happened and it disgusted me. But all I thought was, as a prosecutor, to answer your question, if a defense attorney, like let's say I'm in his shoes and I say, let's make a deal, have him tell the truth, give another statement that nobody can say was coerced, which that was clearly coerced, but then we'll talk a deal, right? Then I'll cut a deal with you. If I had been brought something like that, I would never say I think the way Ken Kratz does. But I would look at it just like I look at the police interview and go, well, what value is this to me? It is of no evidentiary value whatsoever. I don't rely on anything that it extracted from him. So that would, if it were me getting that tape, I mean, I watched it and thought this absolutely is of no relevance at all. Yeah.
I have a question. Yeah. So it seems to me that one thing that sticks out in terms of reforms is also the hardest to reform, and that's the decision to prosecute. So this is for anyone who wants to answer, but it seems the Bernstein case is perhaps, it's an egregious case. I mean, we know for a fact now that he was not guilty of that crime. But the prosecutor was presented with an upstanding woman in the community who claims that she could positively identify a man who raped her in the weeds. So, to what degree do we ask prosecutors to look at, well, this lineup might have not been valid, well, this confession might have been coerced, and to what extent do we say, no, that's the responsibility of the adversary system to sort of ferret those things out? Because my instinct, at least as an individual, is that if somebody presented that accounting of what had happened to her, I'd bury the guy. Mm-hmm. But we ultimately now know that that was not the case. And so, but it seems that it's kind of intractable because you can't get away from that position of discretion. So I just wonder what y'all think about that.
I think you're absolutely right. Prosecutorial discretion is hugely important in any case. And ideally, you have good prosecutors who are taking an honest look at the evidence, right? Thinking about issues like, was this confession coerced? Was this DNA contaminated? What do we know about the practices of the lab that this is coming from? And I think that happens. I mean, I think there are great prosecutors out there. I think the majority of prosecutors are doing their best, right? I think a lot of it is an access to justice issue too, because part of the role here that has to be served is from defense attorneys. And I think we see a profound difference here between the representation that Mr. Avery gets and the representation that Mr. Dassey gets, right? Mr. Avery is able to hire two of the best defense attorneys in the state because he has the settlement from the first case, right? He wouldn't be able to hire Strang and Booting had it not been for the $250,000 he receives, right? And they're really good. They know all of these issues. They're up on all of the scientific evidence. They're able to successfully manipulate and utilize the information available to them. But Mr. Dassey doesn't have that money, right? And he's appointed a public defender. And let me be clear, I don't want to bash public defenders. The vast majority of public defenders that I've seen are incredibly good at their jobs. But we also know that public defenders are incredibly overburdened, right? The average public defender has something like 12 minutes to give to each case, right? Because we don't take public defenders or the right to a public defender seriously in a lot of jurisdictions. And when you have public defenders who are overburdened, they're not able to do the type of work that they need to do, the careful look at the confession, the careful look at the DNA evidence, right? The adversarial system is important, and it only works if we have good lawyering on both sides. And I think that this series highlights the dangers of when that doesn't happen.
And I would say from a prosecutorial standpoint, there are, I don't want to call them measures, but like whenever I go to any continuing education courses or whatever, I always want to know, because I see myself as the gatekeeper, right? I think that the police serve a magnificent purpose in our community. I'm married to a person who works in law enforcement, and so I'm very biased towards that. But I also feel like it's my job to keep that in check. And then there are certain other things, the judge is there, the grand jury is there, the defense attorney is there, but I'm the initial gatekeeper to say, well, wait a second, you can't obtain a confession by using these measures. You're relying on maybe a lab test that is not going to stand up in court. And it's my job at the inception of the case to deal with those issues. And like I talked about earlier, sometimes that means I have to call in a victim's family and say, look, the confession that they got, I'm not going to stand on. I don't think it's good, and I'm not going to file the case, right? But I think it goes back to certain systems being put in place, like ethical obligations and ramifications for actions taken, like have been taken maybe by the first prosecutor in the Bernstein case. When prosecutors know that they will be met by that type of discipline if they make those types of choices, I think it provides motivation to stay educated on what's a coerced confession or what are the strategies that are used to obtain them. I think that sort of thing. But it depends a lot on the individual, just like she was saying.
And CJ, I want to follow up too. I think your question highlights the importance and value of a good working relationship between defense attorneys and prosecutors. You know, if they can communicate in a professional way, then some of these issues can be resolved. And I've seen it both ways. I've talked to a prosecutor where very quickly in the conversation, when I start talking about things that I think are important and relevant, they say, well, I don't care about any of that. You're going to go to trial or you're going to plead. I've also had conversations with many other prosecutors where they say, okay, let's sit down and look at it. Tell me about what is this that you're talking about? And then maybe we can come to a similar way of seeing the case. So good working relationships, good communications. Don't let personalities get in the way. That's really, really important to the process.
Serving as, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Serving as a gatekeeper. And I would point to the fact that as defense counsel, as a federal public defender, a lot of times when we're hearing that story, we recognize that, you know, we have to listen to what our client is saying to us, but we know that we're going to be put to the test with regard to what our client is saying. Quite frankly, I don't think that there's the same standard at times with regard to prosecution. Because as far as witness testimony, there are statistics out there that show that 34% of eyewitness testimony is false testimony. So therefore, as far as holding an eyewitness to the same standard, it can be difficult to do with regard to prosecution. And this gets back to, as far as the investigation of all the facts in the case, it's not that the woman that was the rape victim was not credible.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it was a very tragic thing. But again, as Professor Beck pointed out, you have to take into account, don't let your emotions get in the way. And unfortunately, you know, as far as gatekeeper, you know, this gets back to, you know, Ricky, what you're saying as far as I can't take myself too seriously.
Right.
As far as those emotions, you have to, at a certain point, put emotion aside. And that's what I would caution CJ, that if that were to happen as a prosecutor, you have to be able to look at it objectively and maybe take it into account and discount what would be there.
And a lot of times, too, it's not just conversations with victims' families. I get to have real fun conversations with cops, right? And they've put in hours, weeks, months, sometimes years into these investigations. And so for me to come in, I talked about Monday morning quarterbacking these attorneys. That's really what I do to the cops. And a lot of them, it rubs the wrong way, right? Because they're trying to do their job and they're most of them see themselves, I'm doing the best that I can. But when I go back and say, well, why didn't you talk to this person? And why didn't you talk to that person? And how did you do your lineup? Let me scrutinize that. It's just part of my job. But I totally agree with you. I don't think that all prosecutors do it. And that's the problem. And I'm hoping that that's kind of what we've been talking about. This opens up the conversation where a lot of young prosecutors to be will say, that is my job and I've got to do it.
Ricky, earlier you talked about the community and how much it affects the way that you act, and I guess being part of it. It seems like a lot of these wrongful convictions end up in small towns. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is, I guess, small town justice is a bit of an oxymoron in certain cases because the rumors just grow and snowball to where it's almost impossible to find a juror that has not been tainted? Is that something that should be addressed there, or is that something that's just going to happen and that's something we can't do anything about?
You know, in November, it'll be my 4th year working in Lamb County. And I think whenever I went into that small community, I really perceived that it was going to be a more pervasive issue than it has been. I'll tell you, I was mentioning to Professor Kime Goodwin beforehand, I think we haven't had as many trials. I used to be in trial all the time in Lubbock. We don't have as many trials. We also don't file as many cases in our community. But we do plead out a large number of our cases, right? I would say that in the trials we have had, there hasn't been as much of an issue as I expected there to be, but I think part of that is we don't have news stations there. Usually when we have crime in Littlefield, it's not typically covered by the bigger channels from Lubbock. So people know, and certainly in that kind of environment, usually, like if it happens in Littlefield, well, you know this person because you grew up in Littlefield, maybe you grew up with them or whatever. But I haven't really seen it as much as I expected it to be, where like, oh, that guy, yeah, I know him. And it's like the whole panel of people or something. I expected that more so than what we've had. But the thing about where I work is we've got the entire county. So even if I've got the guy who's, you know, the criminal du jour in Littlefield, I've got jurors that are coming from Olton, Spring Lake, Amherst, Sudan, where maybe I do still have a better chance. Because like I said earlier, I want to start off with both sides on the, I don't want to come back and do this again. I don't want to convict an innocent person. I don't want someone to convict him because he's the guy who always gets in trouble in Littlefield, right? And so I think that though it goes to your, there is a problem with small town justice that I could see obviously still probably exists. But I think that's where you have to have prosecutors who are willing to do the right thing and make sure that the right thing is done, if that answers your question.
I think if you really want an expert on small town justice, Professor Metz and Professor Yandel and their Caprock students who work in our Caprock Public Defender's Office, we ought to send the mic back there.
Professor Metz, we just want to point out that Dane's presumption is wrong. It's not a small town issue. I mean, most of the exonerations are coming out of Dallas. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Ricky accused it, and Ricky sit here and described and didn't realize it. She described the facts of the Timothy Cole case that happened in Lubbock.
Yep.
It's universal. It has nothing to do with socioeconomics. There's no reason I would ever need a mic.
Yes, just kind of piggybacking off that small town justice question, how DAs and judges are kind of they are elected. I was just wondering how much do you see that affecting your work? You know, I think there's a lot. I'm from a small town myself, and I see a lot of pressure as far as DAs go, where it's like, you know, put as many people away as you can.
Yeah, I think that's why my boss is happy to have me, right? Because number one, I'm not afraid to be the bad guy, like I talked about. But I also think that my boss is a good boss, and I think he's a good elected DA because I think he does the right thing for the right reasons, or I wouldn't work for him. But I think that people in I think it depends on who you are as a person, because if people in your community perceive that you're gonna be harsh, but you're going to be fair to everyone, then you live that out and you show them. Now, obviously, it's easy to fall into well, I know this person and his whole family. But I think that's why it's great that we have 2 prosecutors in our office, because anytime we've ever had anything like that where my boss there's even been the appearance of impropriety, those cases come to me, right, as the new girl in Littlefield. But I'm happy to do that because, like I said, I don't know any of these people. I didn't grow up there. So I can make the mean calls if I need to, I guess.
Question down front.
As you mentioned, Professor Sherwin, there was a variety of really good trial advocacy on display in the case. but a variety nonetheless. While many of them were excellent at what they did, you could see some very different techniques and styles. In particular, on the defense side, you have Buting a bit more aggressive, and Strang, who's someone maybe you can sympathize with a little bit better, or who appeals to the jury a bit more. And even it's funny, at the end of the documentary, Buting's reading a blog of some sorts. He says, if you weren't, I can't remember what he said exactly, but like so much of a jerk.
Yeah, his voice was grating, and he seemed whiny, or yeah. Right.
And in comparison to those two, based on your experience and expertise, and being that they were both arguing the same case, do you see one as more advantageous over the other?
I don't. I thought they were both incredible. I mean, one of the things I try and do as an advocacy coach is bring out each individual style. So, other law schools, the way they teach advocacy, I'm not going to mention them by name, but at least I sort of accuse them of trying to mold everybody sort of into the same style. And I don't do that. I think everybody's got their own style, and it's important that you find your own voice and your best way to communicate with jurors and judges. Two advocates I have sitting up at this table are prime examples. I mean, both of these were champion advocates of mine, and they both have incredibly different styles. And I did my best as a coach to try and foster their own individual styles, as opposed to trying to calm Ricky down, because she was a tiger who'd come over the podium and yell at judges, and Brandon was just the opposite, and he was very subdued. In fact, Professor Metz would, I think, judge one of his early rounds, said, "Brandon, you're boring me to death." What did you say, Brandon? Are you sick? Are you not feeling well today? Right? And so you've got to find your own voice, and that's why I encourage everybody to compete in Bob competitions, or go out there and do clinics, or try and do that, so you can try and, through practice, figure out how you're going to best communicate. And I think to answer your question, I think Buting and Strang, two different styles. I think they were both equally effective in my mind, and that's why I say Kratz, a third style that again was incredibly effective.
I have a two-part question. The first is directed at Professor Beck, and the rest is for the panel. You brought up Katz's letter to Avery, and for me it kind of reinforced that he's a jerk, but he honestly believes Stephen Avery is guilty. So I guess one of my problems is he's probably one of the few experts in that trial as the prosecutor. So I guess the question is, why does it matter that those 16 points came from him if they're true? And has anybody come back and said, hey, he's lying, this isn't true, the gun wasn't found in the house, or anything along those lines? And then for the panel, even stepping back objectively, it seems like there's a problem if Stephen Avery didn't commit that murder. I mean, just, mentally thinking, like, how else could this happen? You almost definitely get into some sort of massive conspiracy. Have you considered that, and how do you deal with that?
I just want to clarify the question. When you say get into massive conspiracies, what do you mean?
I mean, it seems like if Stephen Avery is not the culprit, I mean, his brothers had to do it, the police had to be involved, somebody had to have his blood, somebody had to put the, DNA under the hood. It's a conspiracy in the sense that it involves multiple people aimed at, putting Stephen Avery in prison.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll just take them in order. I'm getting two questions, I think, right? The first is a comment that Kratz appears to be sincere in his belief of Avery's guilt. And so how can you really fault him to an extent, right? Who cares if he's behind it all when he's just acting sincerely?
If it's true. I mean, if those points are true. I mean, and the thing about the letter is he's kind of a slimy guy, but he's never saying, I think you didn't do it. It's, I want to write your book about you coming out and confessing.
Right. So I think my first thing I would do is question why he's writing the letter at all. He's achieved his conviction, okay? And when you think someone's guilty and you're a prosecutor, you convict them and then you move on with your life. And what he's doing now, I think that there is a profit motive for doing so. And that makes me question whether he cares at this point at all about whether it's true or not. And the way he presented the case from beginning to end also makes me question whether he cares about anything he said is true. So I think Kratz is not the type of person that believes in seeking justice. He sought a conviction. Kratz is not a person who cares about what he's saying, whether what he's saying is actually true. In fact, he'll say one thing one time and say something completely different another time, as long as it suits him in those types of situations. In terms of the conspiracy, if you read the transcripts of the defense attorney's closing argument, they address this because the Kratz narrative in the whole closing was to believe anything the defense attorneys are telling you. It's very much like your question. You have to believe in this crazy conspiracy, okay? And the defense attorneys are very clear. You don't have to have very many people involved in a quote-unquote conspiracy here. Actually, one or two people could cover the whole thing. And they go through it point by point. And I want to say, I wouldn't even characterize it as a conspiracy. I think you had a situation, much like Buting said, where they did believe they had the right guy, but you want to cement the evidence in that case. You want to strengthen it if you feel at all insecure about it. And one of the ways you do it is starting to cut some corners. And that could include planting evidence. And if we want to talk about conspiracies, there are many examples of law enforcement planting evidence or law enforcement working in partnership with prosecutors to do these sorts of things. So when we call something a conspiracy, I think we're working off of an assumption that it doesn't really happen very often or has never happened, and you really have to defy logic. Well, I think historically we don't have to defy logic to believe that something like this could happen because we know that it has happened.
I would add, I had actually a whole set of slides about this, but I didn't want to go over time. I think we have a huge problem in this country with thinking that criminal cases are puzzles, right? Because that's what media has presented to us for over 100 years, dating back to Sherlock Holmes, that every single piece of evidence has a bearing on guilt or innocence, right? So we see on Law and Order, we see on Sherlock, on CSI, right? And we see this sort of notion even come up in episodes of Serial, right? And the problem is that not every piece of evidence means anything with regard to guilt or innocence. And sometimes those pieces of evidence are going to feel really weird and uncomfortable and bad for the defense. But ultimately, they mean nothing. Why? Well, because we're complex beings. We live in a complex society. We have complex interactions. And so there's something I call it in my seminar, the weirdness. There is weirdness in every case, right? There are things that are not going to fit into the puzzle. And the problem is that we sort of just naturally put the burden on the defense to tie up all the loose ends. And we think if there are any loose ends at all, the defense hasn't proven that the suspect is innocent. But number one, that's not the legal standard. The defense doesn't have to do a damn thing in our country, right? Defense doesn't have to put on a defense. It's the job of the prosecutor to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty, right? And what I see in the list of evidence that's being circulated that isn't addressed is a lot of this weirdness that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Stephen Avery, set his cat on fire one time. That's really awful, right? Let me be clear. I'm not saying anything about that being good. And maybe that means that he's a psychopath, but maybe it doesn't. And it's not his obligation to prove either way, right? Stephen Avery called her 3 times. Maybe that means he's guilty. Maybe it just means they were scheduling a time to meet. It's not his duty to explain away that evidence. And so when I see those 16 things, I laugh, but I'm also frustrated because almost all of them, I would say, 90% of them, are just sort of the weirdness. They're the loose ends that mean ultimately nothing with regard to guilt or innocence unless the prosecution is successfully able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it does. And so the existence of those loose ends means nothing to me, and I think it should mean nothing to the general public, but the problem is we think it's a puzzle piece, and that these threads hanging out there means that he's actually guilty.
I just want to say, because I have my prosecutor hat on all the time, right? And whenever I read the articles about the evidence that isn't getting included, first of all, I'm not offended by the fact that it doesn't get included because it totally makes sense. They couldn't include every single thing that came up in a month-long trial. But I want to say, I totally agree. The weirdness, like stuff that makes a big deal to Nancy Grace, like the guy drew pictures of a burn, tank or whatever. That doesn't change my mind about whether he killed Teresa Hallback or not. Some of the things, like the DNA under the hood, I didn't know about that after watching the documentary, right? Some things, like him calling her, made me, with my prosecutor hat on, think, ooh, maybe he did do it. But I can definitively say at the end of the day, I still do not, I don't understand how we get to a guilty. Because I will never in a million years get over the key. I will never get over that. And so I do buy into some sort of conspiracy. Do I think it's like JFK style conspiracy? No, I don't.
There's a lot of weirdness in that case too.
Yeah. But there's so much that just does not make sense. And a big thing for me too is why lie about the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department being involved in those press conferences? Why do you lie? If you don't have anything to cover up and nothing bad is going on, then you shouldn't ever have to lie. If the truth is on your side, it's always on your side, right? So yeah, somebody planted the key. That's just my 2 cents on that.
Well, and I'll add that the key had Stephen Avery's DNA on it. And the key also did not have blood on it. And that fits the same characteristics of the DNA on the hood.
One last question from Jarrett. So I have a general question. Whenever I watched the documentary, you get the sense that the media was what tainted the jury, or potentially could have tainted the jury, and it kind of led to this mob mentality. But if you also look at this documentary itself, it sparked research, it sparked a lot of insight on the trial processes. Sparked Brandon Beck looking all the stuff up. So I guess my question is, what is your view when it comes to social media and law, and are there ways to basically concentrate it to benefit people instead of lead to a mob mentality?
Well, I'll say I think social media has done an incredible service to a lot of these types of issues. I mean, I've gave illustrations in this case where I think it's kind of embraced some assumptions that I think are problematic. But remember, before that happened, social media was spreading kind of a different worldview that I think is beneficial. And, social media is going to lead to a lot of negativity or conspiracy theories or things like this. But it really is an incredible what we have now in order to have these types of conversations with like-minded people. Get on the Making a Murderer subreddit. I know it sounds nerdy, but I mean, thousands of people talking about every aspect of this case from every possible perspective. We never could do that before. And I think the truth can emerge from what's called a plurality of biases, right? So in a postmodern world, we can say there is no such thing as objectivity, okay? But I think if you get enough people together with different perspectives, something can emerge from that that's very beneficial. So I love social media and what it does in these types of issues.
Well, I don't think we could end any better than that with what Professor Beck added at the end. And I think regardless of whether you believe that Avery is guilty or he's innocent, the value of this documentary is amazing in that it has provoked a conversation among the country, law schools, the public, that we should continue. And I hope that you will continue to talk about this with each other, with your professors, that you'll pursue opportunities here at the law school, wonderful classes that are offered, the clinical programs. And I want to thank you for attending today. This was just a pleasure. And I want to thank the panel and Erica Lux and Oscar Natividad for putting together a fantastic poster, if you saw that outside, and IT as well. So thank you for being here today. I think maybe the panel, if you'd be willing to stay around for maybe just an additional 5 minutes, if anyone has a burning question that wasn't answered and you want to come up here and visit with the panel, that would be wonderful. So thank you very much.
Alrighty, so that concludes the Texas Tech Law panel discussion. That was the Q&A. It was, interesting stuff. The questions were pretty sharp, but I mean, the answers that we got, and especially what they're saying there, particularly at the end where they were talking about there that no matter what, especially whatever you hear the side that thinks that Stephen and Brendan are guilty say, that now it's these documentaries, because this was after the first one, but now it's two. So it's now these documentaries are creating a conversation in the legal community, in the public community, and in classrooms, I would imagine, in law classrooms and everything. So, it's creating the conversation, and people are actually, actively and more than objectively, but like, actively thinking about the facts in this case, the circumstances around those facts and pieces of evidence and various things, and really taking a critical look at those things instead of just an objective look, instead of just going, yes, it's there, so okay, I don't need to know anything more about it. Because that's essentially the way that Wisconsin's playing it, and they're calling everybody crazy who thinks that they may have gotten it wrong. Yeah. So, anyways, very interesting, very, very interesting stuff. But yeah, these documentaries have now created that conversation, and that conversation is happening in many, many places on many, many levels. And hopefully, I'll be able to do my little part over here on my channel to continue to keep the conversation going. Particularly for those out there who like to come and hear what I have to say about the case. So that's about it for today, folks. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.